Bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome everybody. My name is Clarence Epstein. I am the executive director of the Claudine and Stephen Bronfman Family Foundation. The foundation is the proud sponsor of the education program this year for Papier, and it is part of a vision that we have in the foundation that crosses multiple disciplines. When I was reading the catalog introduction by Julie Lacroix, the director of AGAC, what's important in understanding the relationship of art fairs to the rest of the activities that go on during a year in the art world is to underline the fact that by supporting artists and by supporting the work of artists, you not only enrich yourself personally, but you enrich the ecosystem that we are all part of. And that ecosystem is central to our foundation's vision, not only in the arts, but in the other fields in relation to the environment, in relation to entrepreneurship, in relation to the Montreal community, and in relation to the Jewish community that our foundation underlines as our core mission. That in all of these, the ecosystems and the health of the ecosystems within our communities is at the core of what we are trying to improve. And so in this particular field of the arts and in the field of Canadian culture, we are invested in this ecosystem and in all the connections that are required for this ecosystem to be healthy. And one of the themes within this ecosystem is public art. Powerful and unique public art enriches cities, sparks the imagination, and educates by its very nature of being universally accessible. Whether a source of praise, derision, censorship, or celebration, the intention of public art is to elicit reaction and engage all those who pass by it. Today, together with my co-speakers, we will engage and discuss and perhaps sometimes disrupt this question of what is public art and what is its role. With me today are three fantastic representatives of the Canadian art scene. Directly next to me is Shary Boyle, a multimedia artist, the Canadian representative to the Venice Biennale of 2013. Next to her is Gérin, a professor and vice dean of research in the Faculty of Arts at UQAM, and an individual very engaged in the role of art in the public. And next to her is Sara Angel, the founder of the Art Canada Institute, an individual who actually all of us are connected to in some ways in her role as journalist, art advocate, and scholar. And so together, the four of us will first introduce our understandings of public art as they connect to us personally and professionally, and then we will begin discussing and disrupting where we can. So I now leave it over to Sara.
Thank you, Clarence, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you, all of you, for coming out, and I think this is going to be a fascinating topic. I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody else on the panel has to say. And in my role as educator and founder of the Art Canada Institute, what I'm going to talk to you a bit about at the beginning is laying some groundwork for what is public art, in just a brief history of why it is so important, why it matters. And so we're going to start in the 5th century BC. What you're looking at is the Acropolis. And one of the reasons that public art is so significant is that it unites us in our common beliefs, in our common ideas, and our common passions. And it provides a touchstone for all of us to have a collective frame of reference. And when you're looking here at the Acropolis, what many people don't know is that it had a very functional purpose. It was to house the goddess of Athena, who was the goddess of Athens. As well, it was to promote the victory of Athenians. And At the time that it was built, in the 5th century, it was an architectural marvel. It was considered the finest example of its kind. But the other thing that's amazing is that these decorative sculptures, which adorned the building as a very functional purpose, they would go on in time to become emblematic of the most important aspects of Western civilization, of democracy. So with public art, it's often made in a way that at the time when it's created, there's a very functional purpose to it, but later on it takes on this meaning and becomes iconic in its focus. Another example of public art, the Statue of Liberty. So this statue, the decision to create it was made after the American Civil War, where there was an idea of diplomacy between France and the United States, that there would be this statue that would be erected to symbolize the importance of liberty. Now, what's interesting about in the making of this work, which had the motivations behind it, largely diplomatic, largely political, was that then it ended up having a really strong community participation in it, because it took 10 years to raise the funds to create it. The person who raised the funds was Joseph Pulitzer, famously created the Pulitzer Prize. And one of the things that was done to raise funds for it was there was a contest about what words would accompany the statue. And there are famous words that many of you will know that go, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." Well, it was a woman who sent in those words as part of a contest. So one of the things about I know somebody's saying wow in the audience, and it's really quite amazing, because one of the things about public art is that it's so critical for civic engagement. And again, with the Statue of Liberty, when it was created, nobody knew it would be as iconic as it was. Nobody knew that this was going to be the beacon that people would pass by when they were immigrating to the United States, that it would take on meanings of freedom, of liberty. But that ultimately, as a piece of public art, it would unite people around the world in terms of an idea about freedom and the importance of freedom. This is a work by Diego Rivera. It's another type of public art. It was created in 1935. It's situated in Mexico and in Mexico City, and it was created after the revolution. And the reason it was created was that the Mexican government wanted to document the history of Mexico in a story. So in some ways, some public art is very narrative in purpose. Its purpose is to be instructive, so that people can look at pictures and understand the history of where they came from collectively. What ended up happening with this work that's so fascinating is that Diego Rivera also spanned a tremendous movement in creating murals. And so sometimes public art that has a purpose that's very practical can go on to then create different types of art movements. I want to talk about the 21st century and public art, because there is a shift in many ways from it being a tangible object, a statue, for example, to works that are not even permanent. And what we're looking at here is a work by Andy Goldsworthy, British sculptor who works in environmental works, and it's in the Presidio Park in San Francisco. And it was a park that was created by the military army of the United States. And what Andy Goldsworthy did was he took trees from within the park, he created this wonderful pathway of land art, and the idea is that what he wanted people to be able to do was to interact with nature in a way that they were looking at nature and saying, this looks similar to what I see around me, but it also looks very different. It's very much something that wasn't created by nature, but yet at the same time is in conversation with nature. And very intentionally, the artist wanted this work to fade away organically, to disappear with time, because it's also a commentary against commercialism. So again, public art is so important because it reflects the issues of our time, in this case, the issue of environmentalism. And I wanted to show you this amazing work, and this is a work of fireworks created by the Chinese artist Kaigo Tian. And in this work, what took place is the artist had won the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale, so tremendously well known. And the idea was to create a work that for the public, would unify the public, would be of its time, because it would also fade away almost instantaneously. Now, what's so unique about this work is that when it was created, only about 350 people watched it live. However, online, it has become a tremendous internet sensation, as one can imagine. And almost within a week, it had over 5 million views. So we can see that public art also tremendously changes its medium over time, its manifestation over time, its permeability over time, and its messaging over time. And a work like this, it will still be able to be viewed years from now. Its meaning might shift, as did the meaning of the Statue of Liberty, as did the meaning of the Acropolis, but it's something that the artist is creating to unite a group of people together. And so now I'm going to pass the comments on to Annie, who will give us a bit more insights about public art.
I'm going to step in before Annie, and I'm going to present a few of my slides that actually react to Sara's points about civic engagement, which I think are central, where many of us who are here are Montrealers. It's important to underline the fact that this year is the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the Department of Public Art in the city of Montreal. An important contribution, because we need cities and we need the body civic to work together to support the arts and to encourage the installation of art in public spaces. And so on that note, I just wanted to kind of take you through a very light overview. Is that your slide?
It is my slide. I was going to talk about it at the end.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Sorry. So I'm going to explain a little bit about where public art and civic engagement were connected for the last 210 years in Montreal. I was just thinking when looking at Sara's slides, particularly the one of the Elgin Marbles in London, where I had recently been with my kids, and thinking about the fact that most of the pictures that we took when we were in London were always with a backdrop of a public artwork. And one of the public artworks that we photographed as a family last week were in Trafalgar Square, in front of Nelson's Column, in front of the other artworks that were in the Great Square. And for those of you who don't know, the Nelson's Column that is in Montreal predates the one that was in London. And the reason it was created, the first work of public art in Montreal, was because of the joint interests of the Roman Catholic clergy and the British military to celebrate the role of the British conquest in the late 1800s, and the role, of course, that Nelson played in this imperial overtaking in the 19th century. And so the monies raised for Nelson's Column in Montreal were led in part by the Sulpician clergy, with the support of the Jewish community, with the support of the Protestant community, and with the understanding that this work was going to be central in what was then the downtown, the old city today of Montreal, with a view to celebrating the fact that now Lord Admiral Nelson was a hero not only to the British but to the French Canadians. And this was a very interesting political message that the Sulpicians were sharing, and they were making it public, and they were making their support public. Fast forward almost 100 years. Oh, sorry, wrong button. We have another important monument, the Sir George Etienne Cartier Monument, which is sets along Fletcher's Field on Avenue du Parc, erected in 1919. And another important message, a message not only regarding the engagement of the public in the celebration of Sir George Etienne Cartier. For those of you who don't know, Sir George Etienne Cartier was the co-premier of Canada before Canada confederated. So Sir John A. Macdonald was the co-premier with Sir George Etienne Cartier of Canada East and Canada West. And this presentation of Sir George Etienne Cartier as another great hero, a French-Canadian hero of the Canadian Confederation, was an important message again to put both publicly and politically on the scene in a way that today is overlooked because now it's a center for picnicking, a center for the tam-tams, and really another way of using a public artwork to bring communities together. As Sara was saying before also, when you jump into the 20th century, things change and the messages and the commissioners of public art change as well, moving away from clergy and from the state to the private sector and the interests of development. The Alexander Calder, which we still know of today, which was commissioned by the International Nickel Company of Canada to mark Expo 67, the World's Fair, is one of those works also, like the Sir George Etienne Cartier work, that remains part of our modern experience with work, and it is intergenerational. It's a place now where you have celebrations of music and gatherings that still retain their relevance to this millennial generation, much in the same way it expressed the wishes and the hopes of the generation of Canadians that finally were proud to see Canada placed on the international scene in the 1960s. Although that being said, it also was the harbinger of things to come when it came to the Quiet Revolution and the way public art was now going to be perceived by a generation of artists that were no longer necessarily artists that were going to be brought in from outside to do works, that we were going to start celebrating our own. And that transition and that immigration of artists is one that is important to mark the maturity of Montreal and of Quebec locally, nationally, and internationally. One of those artists was Jordi Bonnet, who, although he immigrated from Spain, was really recognized as a great Canadian artist by the 1970s. More than 100 works around the world are displayed by Jordi Bonnet in public settings. He is one of our great underappreciated public artists in Quebec. And this particular work, commissioned for the Montreal Olympics in the P9 metro station, is also an indication of where the government and the public purse was starting to go at the same time that there was this notion of creating public transport in the metro system and integrating art in the metro system. The government, the Quebec government, was ahead of its time in imposing a new program of encouraging private and public developers to incorporate art into their buildings. And this was a very important turning point because it saw the explosion of public art in Montreal in a way that it had never seen before. So this work of 1976, and I end on this one because it's interesting, a work of David Altmed, another Canadian representative at the Venice Biennale, is a work that stands in front of the pavilion of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts dedicated to Quebec and Canadian art. And in this, again, we see a recognition of our local artists, David Altmed, who is recognized, much like Shary is, internationally at a level that now makes us proud that not only they are Canadian, but that their Canadian voices are represented on the international stage. And so public art has that role of connecting us at every level and making us all proud, whether we're visiting London and seeing one of our artists represented in London, or whether we're here in Montreal and understanding the international importance of our local art scene abroad. So I'm going to pass the mic on to Annie, and I think I will pass this on as well.
Thank you. Clarence mentioned the 30th anniversary of the Public Art Bureau this year, and I'd actually like to recenter the conversation on them, because in Montreal they do have a really important impact in how we see public art, how the population uses it, and they're really important stakeholders in the current debates about public art. So, public art, civic art collections usually have similar mandates. I generally see them as being three-pronged. So the first part of their mandate is usually to foster the creation of new public artworks in a city. And this is very important because it helps to structure and helps develop and support a local artistic community. The second main objective is to enhance the experience of citizens. And this is done in more than one way. It makes the city more pleasant to walk around in. It allows the populations to have contact with art in their everyday life. It also allows citizens to recognize themselves in the environment where they live. So there's this very important identitary aspect to public art. And then the third part of their mandate is usually to preserve the public art under their stewardship. And this is equally important because this public art belongs to all of us. So we need the bureaus to be their caretakers. But in the past decades, there have been several new challenges that have arisen. These are due to changes in art practices, but they're also due to changes in definitions of citizenship, definitions of public spaces, and how these public spaces should be working for us. And so this is what I want to address today, because these issues that I'll bring up in a few minutes were not necessarily on the radar of public art bureaus or of corporations a few years ago, but now they are starting to guide decisions about what gets commissions and how we actually talk about public art. So let me go back to the three objectives that I mentioned earlier, and I'll briefly show you some of the examples of how the City of Montreal or other groups have been dealing with some of these specific issues. So the first objective I mentioned was to support contemporary art practices. So contemporary art, there we go. Contemporary art embraces a plurality of practices, you all know that, and so therefore collections are starting to diversify their holdings and are starting to include non-traditional mediums for public art, such as new media. So media art obviously poses a lot of really interesting challenges to public art practitioners and also has limited longevity. So we're already thinking about public art in very different ways. The work I'm showing here, Chorégraphie pour les humains et les étoiles, is a work that you might have seen. It was projected onto the Montreal Planetarium, and it was the first interactive media work purchased by the Montreal Public Art Bureau. Another example of new developments is a work of performance art. J'aime Montréal et Montréal même was performed periodically over 5 years on the facade of the 222 building on the corner of Sainte-Catherine and Saint-Laurent. And this was an attempt by the provincial 1% for Public Art program to introduce performance practices into their holdings. The second objective I mentioned was to enhance the experience of citizens. Now, the notion of a homogeneous community simply no longer passes muster. And so cities are therefore attempting to support projects that express diversity or previously unacknowledged parts of the collective history. Here is an example. While waiting, is to be installed in 2019 at the new entrance of the city by the Bonaventure Highway. And it will celebrate many centuries of indigenous presence on the island that we now call Montreal. It's also worth noting that the artist, Nadia Mir, is the first indigenous artist. She's an artist of Algonquin heritage, and she's the first indigenous artist to be asked to do a major art commission in Montreal. So I think that this is already marking an important step. Another approach to this idea of enhancing citizenship or the experience of citizenship has been to foster ecological works that have a positive impact on the ecology and therefore the community in the broadest sense. Le Jardin des Capteurs no longer exists. It was a spectacular horticultural composition of 2.5 hectares created on the landfill site of the Saint-Michel Environmental Complex, where over 40 million tons of waste had been buried over 30 years. The work functioned to recover the methane resulting from the decomposition of the buried waste to produce electricity. So this was a partnership between Jour de la Terre, Cirque du Soleil, and the city of Montreal. And the third objective that I mentioned was the notion of preservation of collection, which poses all kinds of challenges. But what I want to talk about now is that with the emergence of the diversity of practices, such as performance art, ecological arts, and also media art, the whole notion of perenity itself is being challenged. People are no longer convinced that public art is something that actually needs to stay forever. And so public art bureaus across the country, across the world, are starting to consider funding ephemeral types of practices such as murals and street art. And there's many reasons for this, and some very, very practical reasons. First of all, it's inexpensive, it's less expensive. It's still expensive, but less expensive. It also corresponds to what a lot of emergent artists are doing. And so it responds to new demands of the art world. And it also amounts to, or it allows the experience of the city to be continually renewed. And so citizens in one same environment are seeing their city develop as they do over time. So these are some of the challenges and some of the responses that we've been seeing over the past few years. It doesn't mean that sculptural works are not being made and are not no longer important, but I'm actually very excited by this because it really shows a broadening and diversifying ecosystem. Here's to you.
Thank you. That was super interesting. My name is Shary Boyle, and I'm coming at this from a totally different perspective in that I'm an artist that makes work. And I thought that I'd just briefly speak today about a public art project that I was commissioned to create for the Gardiner Museum in Toronto that was installed this past August. And this is a different perspective too from Ontario because it's very interesting as a contemporary artist to see some of my colleagues work within different provinces and different structures of how artists are commissioned. And it's unique in Quebec here, quite distinct from in Ontario, that we don't have a central organization with the city. The city participates in public art funding project by project, but there's not a single jury or like a kind of organization. And that is, when I think of public art, I think of the diversity of scale and form and material and aesthetic sensibility that I think is sometimes something that people can feel quite overstimulated by, and why so many people have opinions of whether they like a piece or they don't like a piece, because there's just so much differentiation between works. It's interesting, Sara, to see those European kind of classical examples because the level of skill in both sculpture and material and architecture was so phenomenal and awe-inspiring that they are kind of classical examples that stand the test of time. And now things like can be trends, and they might look good for a moment in a year, and they might not look be of interest 5 years later. So the idea of keeping it ephemeral is very interesting. And I also think it's really interesting in terms of commissioning, because there's all of a sudden there's a lot of commissioning in Ontario or Toronto anyways that happens from, say, condominium boards, and they might have a percentage that they can get some kind of tax reduction if they put some art out there. But this can create a really wild like lack of cohesion or in the look of things. And my personal opinion is I would always wish that that money would be put towards building affordable studio space in the condominiums that are developed so that artists could actually live and work in the city and not get kicked out, and save that money from the decorative facade and have an actual live artist experience. I'm just going to quickly go through. This is the Gardiner Museum, if anybody has gone to Toronto and seen it. It's across from the Royal Ontario Museum, and it's around St. George and Bloor. And this collection is extraordinary. I have a big relationship to it, and I personally am not that interested in participating in creating public art because it's an incredibly complicated project and it takes a huge amount of time out of your studio practice. There's some artists that focus on that, and that's maybe one of their major part of their career is going from different public art projects to another. But for myself, it was very unique because I love the collection. They invited me to put in a proposal, and I wouldn't have if I didn't know this extraordinary collection so well and use it often as a reference for my own work. So I had something to say and a reason to say it. I feel there's a way you could approach the artwork as a contemporary artist. You could make a public sculpture that just is a showpiece of yourself. Or for me personally, I believe it should be, it's a civic responsibility where you're having a relationship to the institution or the space or the architecture that you're having a conversation with, and you're serving that. So for me, I wanted to make a work that helped create a kind of invitational gesture into a museum that many people don't know that well, and that focuses on ceramics, which has a bit of a history it's kind of stuffy and not of interest to everybody, and people might not realize what's behind the doors and how extraordinary the collection is. So I felt like it needed something warm, and it is something kind of amusing and humane, but that had many layers of research and information for the kind of insider that understands the history of ceramics, but something for the street of people that aren't educated that can also be excited and find delight in the work itself. There's also, you have to think of so many things when you're an artist. You have to think of the budget, and the budget is really diverse. So this was a $100,000 project, which is actually a small budget in the bigger scheme of things. And it had to be at least 80% created from ceramic. And so that's a massive material challenge because ceramic in our climate is an impossible medium, and that's why you don't see a lot of ceramics outside. You might see them in Spain or places in hot, dry areas, but a ceramic that can withstand the test of our climate from such cold to such heat, and especially when you can see on the right side, there's Jan Kaneko's head, and he's a quite famous Japanese-American artist that creates these massive heads that are extruded ceramic that are about almost 12 inches thick. Ceramic, and there's nothing else in them, so there's no other expansion contraction issues between different materials. But for me, I wanted to make something more in line of sculpture that was clad in ceramic, and so I had to consider the different rates of expansion and contraction in the climate between metals, foams, all the different kind of synthetic materials, and bronze that I was working on with the legs. I'll just read you a really quick part of my proposal, because I had to put in quite a large proposal with a budget, because you have to really understand how to work with fabricators and follow a project through on time and within budget to create something fairly monumental. So it's consisting of a 7-foot-tall, smashed and restored vase. I really wanted to do something broken. When I think of ceramics, I think of it's breaking. And it's also across from the ROM, so it's archaeological pots. The idea that when we dig, when we are looking for early civilizations, we often understand and learn about them through the objects that they made, the culture that they produced, and often it's those early shards of pots that make us know who those people were. So it's a reference to the ancient pottery shards of archaeological digs. And it's also like Humpty Dumpty. Its recombined elements remind us of the extraordinary care taken to preserve a collection of inherent fragility. The materials and form evoke transformation and alchemy. Because of the shape of the flask, it has kind of an alchemical reference. And porcelain in Europe, porcelain is something that it's evoking here, the whiteness of it. It's not made of porcelain. It would have been impossible to do that material outside. But in porcelain, the origins of it in Europe, it came from China and Asia, but Europeans really wanted to figure out the recipe themselves. And so the story is in Meissen and early Germany and Saxony, that August the Strong kind of kidnapped an alchemist who was bragging that he could find the arcanum or the recipe for porcelain, and he threw him in the dungeon until he could figure it out, because he was obsessed, the king was obsessed with porcelain. He was spending way too much money on it. He needed his own cheap production in-house. So he got this guy and put him in chains until he did figure out how to make porcelain for Germany. And so that is Meissen in 1700s. And so I think of alchemy, and ceramics is the first synthetic material that humans ever made, so there's a form of alchemy there. It's reimagining damaged goods as accessible treasure, this broken vase put back together. It kind of dares us to confront our complicated relationship to vulnerability and value. And I think in the contemporary art world, we can think about that a lot, like the value and who makes the value, and vulnerability when things are broken and who's going to caretake for them. So for me, I kind of think the key to making a public sculpture work is to make it speak of a particular location at a particular time. So it's relating to the collection inside, and the work itself is kind of in place and having a conversation with the people that pass by it daily, because it is their work as well. They're the ones that are seeing it most often. So I feel like having an engagement is so key, because the work should last past the artist if it does, if it's not a transient piece. But this was an experimental piece in a way, because the combination of materials I use, I did a ton of research, but they're unprecedented. So although I had where did my little guy go? There's the kind of rear end of it. It's very Daffy Duck. It's kind of gently tilting towards the viewer to welcome them in. It's my niece's legs, who I photographed and sculpted in my studio and had cast in bronze. The pieces, there's over almost 300 individual porcelain shards that were created. The model was created on software very diligently, myself and another artist, ceramicist, Andy Brayman out of Kansas City. He's who I worked with to create the clay body. It's a stoneware body, and the glazes for our climate, because Kansas is very similar. So he's done a lot of architectural work. So we feel confident about this clay. But getting, just the problem solving involved in those complex curves, and having each piece of the puzzle fit perfectly when it was assembled on top of my form, and it had to be mapped out so it was absolutely precise, because if you could imagine, when I got those pieces in my studio and I had the form to apply them to, you can't just willy-nilly start sticking them on, because each individual piece has to be exactly on the right angle. You can't even go off. There's a little bit of wiggle room with the more kind of grout in between the pieces, but not much. So a lot of problem solving had to go into exactly how to apply them, and it's fascinating, but way too long to get into here. And then, of course, you have to work with structural engineers, because public sculpture can't fall down and damage people or blow away in the wind. And it's actually the wind that is more of a worry even than like different things that could possibly, like I was amazed that the piece, which is almost 1,000 pounds, could be standing on two legs. I thought it would need a third point of connection, but it can stand on two internal legs as long as it's designed properly by a stamped engineer that understands the angles and the kind of wind of the weight of the piece. So here I am working with the people that engineered the foam, actually, and then put a fiberglass coating. They usually do cars, but they did, in this case, I worked with them, did the fiberglass. And then the installation, which is always really crazy after almost 2 years of creating the work and researching it. It was put together there and now lives there permanently, and it went through its first winter wonderfully. There was icicles on it. It was a very severe winter in Ontario too, and I installed it. It was almost 40 degrees, so it's had the whole range of climate, and it's doing great. I think that's it. So yeah, there we go. Yeah. And so I'm going to leave it there, and you can have questions afterwards.
So thanks very much, Shary. Actually, that last slide is interesting because I think of the first slide that Sara presented of kind of, Athena on the Acropolis, and then we see this particularly interesting figure also kind of at the Gardiner Museum representing a contemporary version of the kind of public art now that it is intended to engage you by its quasi-humanity, in this case, a reinterpretation. So we've had presentations by an art advocate, a scholar, a practitioner, and myself, an administrator. And we're going to open up the discussion here at the podium around 3 questions that we're going to hopefully then later ask you to jump in and comment and ask us questions about. And I guess the first one, and it's based on the fact that we've had a case study now of Shary's work in Toronto as a point that maybe we can depart on, because the first question I want to bring out to our group is, who commissions public art, and what is that relationship with the individuals or the organizations that commission it and the final product? So, Shary, in your case, you were working with a client that was the Gardiner Museum. How did they interpret and work with you in terms of the vision that you had versus the vision that they had?
That's a great question, because this isn't a kind of an exhibition you do inside the gallery where really the artist leads and the curatorial team would have very little input on the content of what an artist's exhibition would be. This is a public work that is representing the institution, and there's all sorts of stakeholders at play. And one of those stakeholders is always the patron, because in this particular case, and often the case, a private donation or sponsor would be involved with the City of Toronto. So this was a piece that was sponsored by a private foundation and was also afforded by the City of Toronto. So there was no... They felt, once they obviously selected my work from a short list and were really excited and very, very supportive of the piece, it was really hands-off. It was up to me to figure out the challenge of creating the work, but in terms of content, I thought about that myself when I'm designing the proposal. I want to create a work that has all of these different kind of signifiers and symbols and references, but nothing that would be offensive or traumatizing. But I like subversion, so there's actually hidden subversions within the piece. The fact that it's broken itself, and the front decal is a Canadian decal from the 50s of kind of vernacular ceramics, and it's called Canadian wheat, so this would be a popular pattern in really affordable, generic houseware that many people, you could find this pattern in Value Village or eBay, but it also is wheat. Well, so wheat we associate with Canada, but it's a world food source, and wheat is an immigrant grain. brain. So we think of things as Canadian, but there is no such thing as Canada. Canada is a nation project that was created on top of Indigenous land. So this piece is broken. It's broken in 300 shards, and it's put back together with kintsugi, so it's got a gold seam, so there's compassion and sensitivity for the imperfection of our nation. So there's a lot of symbolism inside of a piece that could be just delightful for a child to see. But in terms of the patron and the museum, we had a very good symbiotic connection. The only thing that I did come up against is the title, because I originally wanted it to be called Cracked. I just wanted it cracked right up, and that was not seen as I got a lot of blowback from that. People didn't want that to be called cracked.
I think the Canadian egg industry probably took opposition because I think it's their motto as well.
It became cracked wheat.
So, Shary obviously takes her own ideological position on identity and on geography that I think is important when you look at public art. And Annie, you were mentioning the current trends by artists to work on kind of an ephemeral basis. How does that ephemeral plan impact the relationship with people who commission or normally commission public artwork, and do the artists care anymore about that relationship?
This is really, really new as a practice. I think there are cities that are a little bit more seasoned than we are, and that have found solutions to work around it. I'm thinking, for example, well, you were mentioning your vacation in London and visiting Trafalgar Square. So there's the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square where works of art are commissioned to be public artworks for 2 years, and then they move on. So the artists know that the piece is made for that. It'll actually allows them quite a bit of freedom in terms of materials, which, Shary talked about how she needed to think about her works as being able to sustain the Canadian climate. If it's meant to last for 2 years, there are things you can do that you couldn't do otherwise. So I think that does allow different kinds of practices. But I think that public collections, as opposed to private collections, are still a little bit wary about it, because it's difficult to defend to a community that we're spending money for something that will disappear. And so then the role of cultural mediation becomes very, very important. There's an important role for education that has to be done if these practices are being put out in the public.
I think it also speaks to this particular generation, and I guess I distinguish myself because I don't connect in that way to that reaction. A reaction that Shary brought forward in explaining really what national identity is or isn't for her, and what ephemera then becomes for people who feel that they don't have to be the citizen of a place or have to belong to a community to feel like they're part of something important. And Sara, you travel across Canada regularly. You visit all the cities. You see how public art interacts within the various cities in Canada. Do you think that public art has a role in bringing together national identity or civic identity per se, and as a counterpoint to what Shary said about her position on the role of art and its context publicly?
I think that public art has always played a tremendous civic role. And the interesting thing, though, is our civic values change all the time. So although Shary might be working in a manner that is subversive, I believe that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people are going to look at Shary's piece and they're going to look at it in the context of 2018 is when it was unveiled, 2018, 2019, saying this was a moment in Canadian history that the 150th anniversary of Confederation just took place, and the nation had a very mixed response to that event. And this is a work of art that reflects what was taking place at that time. So again, when the Statue of Liberty was created, it was created as a work that was a piece that was ultimately about diplomacy between two nations. Looking at it 150 years later, it has a very different meaning. But I think that something that the conversation has brought forth today, and everybody's comments have brought forth, is that public art is so around us. We are so surrounded by it all the time, and yet in some ways we take it for granted. And in so many ways, it is the very essence of what helps define us, not just us as Canadians, but in a broader context, us as citizens in the world, our beliefs in the arts and so forth. And so it works in such a different way than private art in terms of the way it's commissioned and so forth. But the importance that it plays in both defining society and understanding it, and as a historical reflection, is so tremendous.
And that historical reflection is interesting because some of us presented this notion of the evolution of public art and who commissioned it. And so we saw that it evolved from nobility to the clergy to the eventual high net worth 19th century landlords to eventually the state. And now we see private developer and organizations like museums and universities and condominiums looking at public art as a way of completing their structures. And Shary said something, and I want to have the reaction of the others about what she said. She wished that this condominium developer would have taken the money that she obviously disagreed with in terms of the quality of the artwork and used it for the purposes of advancing art in another way. So what is the artist's responsibility in this discussion? Is it what Shary said exactly, to weigh in on the role of public art, or do you feel that there are other ways that public art can be engaged with the artist that are allow the viewer to complete the artwork as opposed to the developer? Do any of you want to speak to that?
It's a really good question. I want to go back to the question of studios for a second, though, because it is such a crucial aspect. And in a place like Montreal, we know that there's less and less studio space available, and that artists are struggling. So your point resonated
much
with me.
worse.
You're absolutely right. At the same time, I have to say that I love personally public art, and I think it's important as one of the points of references in our cities that make our cities livable. And I think that we would, as a society, we would lack a lot if we didn't have that. So I'm actually really, really happy that the 1% for the Arts project exists, because it forces corporations to take responsibility for the space that they take in the city and the mark that they operate on the territory. So I think that is part, actually, of the responsibilities of cities and governments to include the corporations and the artists in this discussion about.
It's interesting because I don't think artists are often a part of the conversation because we're not a part of the funding structures. So we may have opportunity to participate as creators, but not to steer how it moves. When you're talking about that 1% program, I think of how architecture has shifted since the earlier European kind of times where there would be gargoyles and kind of hunky punks and all these amazing decorative elements with the structures, it's beautiful, and how architecture has become more and more simplistic. And I think that maybe those roles of those 1% are going into the little decorative motif, the only thing allowed in our public streets that is very focused in one area that the artist creates, instead of something that we can look along all architectural elements and be awed and amazed by the beauty of the decorative. So that's something, but artist space, it's kind of the difference between life, something alive, and something that's just in history. Right? If the artists don't have a place to live and create, then we have objects that represent them, but not them themselves. So.
I agree with
It's
that.
kind of that public art can be something about supporting and having artists actively in your life.
Agreed. But in defense of the private developer, of whom I've often worked with, not all of them do great things. Some of them do great things. Some of them need to be educated. And an important role I think that the artist has, or hasn't had before, is really to be this bridge between the art world and the developer, so that the developer doesn't just stop at one project with them, but gets addicted to this notion of how art completes their projects and how art completes their vision. Because developers, even though sometimes we see them as purely in their capitalist form, are the ones that develop cities. Montreal is really not a city that was built on corporate money. It was built on the small developer, on the individual, on the immigrant, on the visionary that decided to buy small pockets of land and react to the pockets of land next to them, so that although there's a certain cohesion to the city, there's a certain eclecticism to the city. And it's part of that broken telephone effect that I think public art can often have when you look at an artwork and then you look at the artwork next to it and you ask yourself, how is one artwork responding to another? How is one artwork reacting to the architecture that isn't necessarily next to it, but that it is commenting on? And that becomes part of a larger discussion of the role of public art and the role of the public in the reaction to public art. So I wanted to bring the discussion out to the audience a little bit before the panel speaks a little bit to some of the artworks that we feel are exemplary. And so I'm going to invite anyone here who has any question to either raise their hand or indicate to Maude that they would like to ask us a question. And following that, we'll kind of jump into some of our coup de coeur works that we feel were game changers in different cities. Anybody want to ask something?
It's such a contentious subject. I'm sure everybody has opinion.
Right. Yes. Maude's going to pass on the mic. And for those of you who aren't comfortable speaking in English, feel free to ask the question in French, and we'll translate it.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you all. My question is, what happens when public art becomes controversial? That the context in which it was originally designed as a work of art to affirm culture, society, and circumstance changes. People see and take up that public work in a very different way, and maybe destroy the work, destroy the history and the context. How do you feel about that? Is it right or wrong? How do we make sense of that?
Oh, just before you answer, Clarence, do you mind just wrap it up because the microphone, like, we're bugging just for
Yes,
you were
sure.
on the internet, please.
Yeah,
Sorry
so
about that. Thanks.
just essentially, when a controversial work suddenly kind of shifts in public opinion, how does that shift have an impact on the present discourse of art and the public? Does anybody want to bring anything
I
into
can
it?
start and then pass the mic to my colleagues. The journal Espace, who some of you might have seen in the entrance, has an issue coming out in a few weeks, I think, that will address this issue. So I encourage you to go and look at it. It's such a complicated question, and everybody's been talking about it for for many years, but especially since Charlottetown and New Orleans, and then in Halifax, there was the Cornwallis piece. We're talking about pieces in Ottawa and across the country, in Winnipeg. And so, yes, all of a sudden, these monuments that we did not question became racist, sexist, violent, and do we want these to represent ourselves as a society? It's a huge question. I'd have to say that I don't have a firm answer. I think that they're all different. You know, we really need to look at the communities and the cases. But from my point of view, I think it's really that preservation, and you might have seen my bias towards the ephemeral, so it's coming here through again. My personal bias is that preservation should never be an end in itself. We preserve things in museums because we want the community to share in them. We preserve monuments because we think they're important for our understandings of who we are. That's why we have heritage and museums and all of these things. It's not, heritage is not an end in itself, it's a means to talk about ourselves and carry through ideas. And so my way of thinking about it is definitely not to just go ahead and destroy everything because we might regret it. I mean, there's many values to a work of art. However, we really, really need to think about the community and about the social justice aspect of what is located in our public spaces because we live with them.
I was going to add that the Diego Rivera slide that I showed of the history of Mexico, that's a very contentious work right now because it's essentially a piece of government propaganda. Marxist piece of propaganda, some say. The artist, however, was an extraordinary artist, and so the work is there. It fortunately is not a work that deeply offends. It's more a political sensibility, but I think there is as much a history of art that has been destroyed, going back to ancient Egypt. And we all know about the destruction of Byzantine icons. So it is very, very complicated. But history has shown when works were destroyed, it usually in the end wasn't a positive thing. Because ultimately, what art is doing is it's reflecting our own culture at a particular time and serves as a touch point for study.
When you think about when historically work was destroyed, it would have been often a colonial force that wanted to kind of overtake another culture's realm and plant their supremacy over top of it. So that's a way of destroying someone else's culture and someone else's past. And in the kind of heroic sculptures we're looking at now that might have been in America or Canada of military people that represent ways of thinking that now people are understanding as racist and colonial in a very violent and oppressive way, that they're also, I thank God that we have come to the point where we're recognizing that and we're not still in a place of just blindly accepting those values, but they also could be something that helps teach us. So I hesitate to completely erase something because without the object we can forget that that happened. So I'm wondering if there's ways that they become companion pieces where there's a new commission that goes beside it, or that piece gets taken off the pedestal and something new that's directly responding to it that talks about the history could take place, you know, so that there's something that is a constant evolution of thought.
Any other questions? I mean, I can speak to that issue as well on a more... the issue of cultural appropriation right now is a hot topic in Canada, and we see it in the arts media very often. In Montreal, several years ago, the city of Montreal contemplated the demolition of Viger Square, which had important works by Charles Daudelin. And in listening and in acting also as a professional commentator on radio shows for it, I had obviously defended the importance of this cultural memory, and in trying, as Shary said, to adapt to what pre-exists with a contemporary view to the need of a square in the 21st century. But what was shocking was how when the radio shows opened the mics and up and the phones to callers, how callers would not even want to talk about the art anymore. They wanted to talk about the amount of money that it was going to take to create new art, and why not take that money and put it into the daycare system, or putting it into something that has nothing to do with the fact that all these issues are important, and there's no reason why we have to supplant art so that the daycare system can survive. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to become a little more culturally aware of the role that art plays in our community, so that we don't have to confuse issues that have nothing to do with each other, but that are equally important. And whether it has to do with looking at history and being critical of history and our leaders and what they did in the past, with a contemporary view to using it as part of a healing or a learning process, is just as important an act as negatively would be to destroy the work and try and erase it from the conversation. So if there aren't any questions, we're going to jump into our coup de cœur and give you a little sense of what, for us, are important works and why. I'm not sure which is the first one, but I'm going to move it ahead here. Whose is this?
That's me. That's me. This is a work by Jean Dubois and Chloé Lefebvre. So it was installed in various places for a few months at a time. It's an interactive video device, and it allows viewers to interact with it by phoning the phone number that is there, and then by blowing into their cell phone, people can interact directly with the work, blowing the bubbles and retracting them until, if they blow really, really hard, the whole thing explodes. The reason why I really, really like it is that quite often works of art become invisible after having been seen too often. This kind of approach of an interactive and kind of poetic and funny work creates this sort of intimacy with viewers, and it allows them to actually really be part of the artwork and think about it in different ways. So I really love it. And this is my favorite of all times, really. It's called Commutable. It was commissioned by the New York Public Art Fund, which has been sponsoring for about 20 years now ephemeral works. They're put in place for 3 to 10 years. And they're all extremely creative, experimental. So this one was installed in a pedestrian and bike path on the Manhattan side of the Williamsburg Bridge. So it's made, the bridge, the entrance was gilded with 22-karat gold leaf. And as the project aged over the 3 years that it existed, the gold was gradually worn away, and so people started carrying bits of it with their shoes throughout the city. So there's this kind of poetic infiltration that happened through that. And so what I liked about it is that, you know, it's kind of uncanny and incredibly beautiful. Can you think of going to work in the morning and being faced with that? Like, that would put a smile on my face. What I also like about it is that it marks the passages of time in a really, really interesting and subtle way, and pays homage to the pedestrians that use the bridge. And so if you kind of think of the tradition of monuments that paid homage to political leaders and heroes, this actually does the absolute opposite. It pays homage to the everyday and to the users of these spaces. So I think that there's something in there that is kind of a really good model to think about what public art is.
This is the piece that I chose as my favorite piece. It's a piece that was created in 1983. Many of you will have seen it. It's outside of the Georges Pompidou, and it is a fountain. It's called the Stravinsky Fountain. And what happened was that in the early 1980s, the City Council of Paris put out a call. They said they wanted to do a series of fountains around the city. And actually, the person who received one of the commissions was an artist named Jean Tinguely, and he created works that were just black and white mechanical figures. He's Swiss in origin. He's married to a wonderful French artist named Niki de Saint-Phal. And so I also love this work because he decided that he wanted to take his work up a notch and work with her. He brought her into the project. It was originally controversial when he did so. But what it is depicting is it's depicting Stravinsky's Rites of Spring, and there are 16 different components within the fountain. And one of the other reasons it's, I think, a really unique piece of public art is that fountains tend to be very grand in most traditional senses around Paris. And in the same way that Annie was talking about sort of subverting what something is supposed to be as a piece of public art, this was a subversion of sorts, because what the two artists decided is that they thought, we want to create a series of street performers. We want to make street performers as put them into a fountain. And so each element in the fountain is a performer in of itself. And it bucks against the notion of a fountain being a very grand, monumental thing. And yet, this has become one of the most iconic components of Paris right now. And so I think it works as a piece of public art because it's something that challenges what public art is. It's enjoyable to so many individuals, and it plays on so many different components of what art is about in terms of color, water, mechanics, artifice, and it's interesting because in 1983, the idea of what would be interactive is so different than, not even 50 years later of what we see as interactive. But that's finally the other component that works really well here, is that the artists were thinking, how do we create a work that interacts with the public?
Okay, so you just had one, Sarah?
I just had one,
Okay,
because I had so
all right.
much to say about it.
Well, speaking of different cultures and who public art represents, we're speaking from a European, Jewish, and white kind of cultural position, but there's many cultures in the world and in Canada that have a completely different relationship to what public art meant to them culturally. So when I thought about some public art that really I think is extraordinary, I automatically thought of the Haida and the Northwest Territories poles and the totem poles. Culturally, that would have started up at Haida Gwaii and kind of moved down the coast. And they were commissioned by high status and powerful members of the society, such as chiefs or head families, and they had different purposes within the community. They could have been ancestral stories or welcome signs for the village visitors, or kind of funeral rites, or sometimes bodies were actually buried within the poles themselves. But I wanted to point out this tradition that is lesser known, and they're called shame or ridicule poles. So these poles were created to embarrass individuals or groups for their unpaid debts to society, or when they did something wrong. So the poles were placed, they were commissioned by a family that had a grievance against another individual, which would have taken a lot of money and time to create. So this is not a light thing. It's a very serious grievance. If you get a shame pole, you've done something really wrong. So they're placed in prominent locations, and they'll be removed after the debt was paid or the wrong corrected. So you would have real incentive to do something. So I feel like this really serves a social function, these kind of artworks, and they're extraordinary and so beautiful. And this particular one is a famous one, what was made in 1869. It's called the Seward Pole, and it's in Alaska. And the pole was commissioned by the Tlingit chief to shame the former U.S. Secretary of State, William Seward, for not reciprocating generosity of his Tlingit hosts following a potlatch, which would have been a feast and a gift-giving ceremony given in his honor. And he didn't really understand that he was to give back. So that's an issue. He got a shame pole, and the intent of this pole is indicated by that's him, and his ears and his nose are painted red, and that's to symbolize his stinginess. I've got one more. And this, I just wanted to do something contemporary, and funny enough, it really, it's kind of a companion to yours, Annie, in that it's in the, it's an artwork, sorry, I got the name of the artist, by Tom Otterness, who's a New York-based artist. You might have seen it in New York. It's at the 14th and 8th subway station, and there's over 100 little cast bronze sculptures depicting life in New York. So they're very tiny, and they're peppered amongst a massive station. And what I really love about this is that it does the same thing. It kind of celebrates the pedestrian, but it also deals with scale, because we're so so used to public art and art in general. It's all about the monumental and the bigger, the more important, the more, kind of epic, that we feel pressured in order to have some awe-inspiring thing. But these little works, they have 5 different character types. There's the blue-collar workers, there's white-collar workers, there's radicals, there's rich people, and there's police officers. And they're all interacting in these tiny little moments throughout the kind of city. And they're so small that they force you, when you see them, to kind of bend down and stop and look, which is completely opposite to the situation that we feel in New York, which is that it's so monumental, it's such a massive metropolis, and it's a parallel to the tininess that we feel in such a gigantic situation. So it's really effective, it's really funny, and it's politically subversive, and it kind of manages to do something that you think is actually really difficult for an artist to do.
So my piece, my coup de cœur, brings us back to Montreal. This is a work by Nicolas Bayer. It is a work that was a 1%, as Annie had mentioned, a work that was part of the government program to integrate art into architecture. It was commissioned by me for Concordia University, and the resonance that I have for this is on many levels. One, obviously, I have a great affection and personal connection to the project. What it encompasses, however, is so meaningful and so successful that I can't help but always marvel at how well Nicolas Bayer and his team were able to adapt to the needs that such an artwork required. First of all, at the time, Concordia University was in a major expansion phase, and they were envisioning a building that was going to merge engineering, computer science, and the visual arts. And so they needed an artwork really that was going to encompass this multidisciplinary notion that the university at the time was moving forward on. They were also dealing with a great heritage challenge, which was that the York Cinema was slated for demolition as part of the expansion plan. And as a result, they had to come to terms with the heritage memory of a building that was of great affection in terms of Montrealers' experience with the cinema from the 1930s onward, when this Art Deco cinema was in its heyday. And so Nicolas Bayer, who won the competition, the largest competition at the time for the 1%, and it still might be the largest competition. It was about a $500,000 commission. Envisaged something that for us as a jury was incredibly smart and thoughtful in its vision. The first thing he realized was that he was replacing this historic cinema. And so for him, this notion of a large screen, a screen onto the city, was a very important memory cue for visitors to the area. The second thing, of course, was that he needed something that was going to reflect the composition of the university and the multidisciplinarity of the university. So he took a variety of local plant types and international plant types and mixed them together in this abstract new bouquet of flora that represented the population of the university. And then when he looked at that population of the university, he remembered also the connections to the environment of which it was in, which was right across the street from this little jewel of a church called St. James the Apostle on St. Catherine and Mackay, that had these stained glass windows, of which he saw this giant window as being this projection of a stained glass notion onto a public building. And ultimately, he wrapped it all together with this face that looks onto the downtown core and connects the university to the city. This idea that Concordia and the program that I led, which was called the Quartier Concordia, was integrating art, architecture, heritage, and public engagement into one place, into one space, for the purposes of connecting everybody and for the purposes of perennity. So on that note, on behalf of the Claudine and Stephen Bronfman Family Foundation, I'd like to thank Sara Angel, Annie Gérin, and Shary Boyle for joining me in this discussion, and to thank you all for coming, and to encourage you all to continue walking around the fair and visiting our galleries and supporting them, and not hesitating to speak to any of the dealers or the representatives, and learning as much as you can about art, because that's one of the purposes of fairs in our city. So thank you very much.